In my talk today, I want to connect, or try to connect, three basic things: animals, food, and the ways that humans use those ideas, the way they combine those three ideas to define their identity, or who they are as members of a culture and a society. And specifically, I want to talk then about how archaeologists can combine these ideas to study a particular kind of cultural identity, specifically ethnic identity, by looking at animal bones from ancient sites. Now, we define ourselves as human and what kind of human we are in a binary way. We assert who we are, and at the same time, we assert very strongly who we are not. In other words, we define boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. Who's inside the tent of our group and who is an outsider. And we do this in a lot of different ways. And I want to show you today that food is one of the most important of these ways that we define who's inside the tent and who is outside. This need to define ourselves lies at the very core of our identity, who we are. And it's one of the key elements of human culture. Now, there are lots of different ways to think about culture. That's an understatement. And a lot of people just loathe the very idea of culture. And Hermann Goering, of course, Hitler's right-hand guy, is famous for having said, "When I hear the word culture, I reach for my revolver." Now, I think he was being a little narrow-minded there. And in fact, it turns out that culture is an extremely important concept. Whether you like it or not, it's there and it's extremely important. So what is it? Culture is it can be defined in many ways, and I'm giving you the one that I find is a very useful working definition. Culture is a set of shared beliefs, symbols, language, and practices that it's shared by a group of people, and it defines them as a society, as a social group, and it structures their behavior. You could think of culture as almost the operating system for human beings. It's the master system that defines who we are and what we do. Ultimately, culture is what makes us human, and it differentiates us from animals. No other animal on the planet has the capacity for culture that we have. That's genetically, we're about 99% similar. This is the true difference. Now, a big part of the beauty and the complexity of culture lies in this paradox that there can be so many different cultures around the world, and yet, at the same time, they can share so many basic principles. And understanding that variability and that underlying similarity in cultures in the plural, and that underlying similarity in culture as a property of what makes us human, that's one of the main things that anthropologists do. So another way to think about culture is that it's a kind of a shared symbolic code. It operates by using symbols and metaphors. And I know that sounds kind of woo-woo, but symbols and metaphors are a very visceral and powerful kind of symbolic shorthand that conveys an incredible amount of information and emotional non-rational information at the same time. So that's why I tried to put up on this slide a series of images relating to the word culture, because I think it would be impossible for the people in this room to look at these images and not say right away, oh yeah, that's the United States of America, that's America. And it's not just because of the flag, it's because of a whole set of very shared rituals and beliefs and symbols that are all encoded there, and language that's encoded. Just those 3 words, we the people. Well, there are lots of places around the world that use English, even as their primary language, but only here in America would those words, we the people, resonate in a way that defines us as a group, as a society, regardless of who you are. Even if you hate the idea, you still know it's us, right? So these symbols are very, very powerful. And part of their power lies in the fact that we don't even think about them consciously. They're so deeply embedded in us, socialized into us, that they're a kind of unconscious habit, or as Pierre Bourdieu, the French anthropologist, calls it a habitus, an unconscious way of doing things in your everyday life. You go through everyday life and you don't say, I'm proud to be an American. You just are, right? And part of what defines you as such, these are a small set of those symbols. So obviously some symbols are more important than others. And there are, I think, we can identify a number of what I would call central cultural metaphors or central cultural symbols that define us. And 2 of the most interesting ones are in relation to animals. And they're almost diametrically opposite, and yet they're both symbols that define us who we are. One of them is using animals as metaphors or symbols for people. And my late father, as a Francophile, would be deeply disturbed by this, but it's really interesting that we use animals as metaphors for other cultures. So the English, ever since the Napoleonic Wars, I think, have just loved to call the French the frogs, defining them in terms of food. They define them as an animal and as in terms of food, because they eat frog's legs. And of course, the French referred to the English as les roast beef. So it works both ways, although this is vastly more entertaining. Another really fine example is this political cartoon here, where the animals are metaphors also for entire nations or cultures. And on the left, you see the Russian bear, who's just greedily drooling over the emir of Afghanistan, and the very noble English lion, which is, of course, dead set on protecting Afghanistan by invading and conquering it. So animals are very important metaphors and symbols for how we define other cultures, how we define them as other, as different from us. And at the same time, we use animals as, and we think about them, and they have very important symbolic resonance as food. And in fact, that would be probably what would occur to you first and foremost as the primary central symbolic importance of animals. And animals as food are important in a number of ways. One is food preferences define our culture, what we like to eat, les roast beef, the frogs, right? The prohibitions, what we do not eat, what we're not allowed to eat, what we find just totally revolting, those also define us culturally in terms of what I'm calling these boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. One of the greatest videos that I really urge everyone to go home and watch on YouTube it's called Food Fight. And it's a military history of the United States in the 20th century, all done as this animation with different foods. So the Americans are represented as hamburgers. The war in Vietnam is the hamburgers going to war with the spring rolls. The Cold War is, I think it's beef stroganoff versus hamburgers. It's really wild. So I honestly, as homework for the festival, I urge you to look at this. So the foods we eat are boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. I want to highlight some of them. Foods that we think of revolting, this was the most fun slide to put together, is this market in China where they're selling dog. And then this middle one is rat kebabs, or ratatouille, I suppose. And then this one I only learned about from reading a junk novel about a month ago. Apparently in Iceland, one of the very favorite dishes is called hakari, and it's putrefied shark meat, which I find revolting, but they don't. So these are ways that food is used as drawing boundaries of exclusion, food that we find revolting, they do not. Another important aspect of food and food preferences has to do with the way we draw boundaries by who we will eat with and who we won't. And that's a very important part of food prohibitions. We always ask, well, geez, why is that forbidden? Why is, and these food boundaries are very important. For instance, one of the most best known ones is the Jewish and Muslim prohibition against eating pork. And how could anyone want to eat such a cute animal? Another very well-known one is the Hindu prohibition on eating cattle. And this is a document from India sort of explaining that prohibition. And then even within a society, whom we eat with and whom we won't eat with is a very important way of drawing boundaries. In this case, boundaries of class or caste. So this is showing you a dinner for a Brahmin in India. And in the Indian Jajmani or caste system, the Brahmins are very concerned with maintaining purity. So they're eating off of a plantain leaf, and everything here is disposable because maintaining purity with respect to other castes in India means that you can't even eat off of vessels that have been used by a lower ranked caste that is defiling to the sense of purity. So think about that. Think how food is operating to draw these boundaries of inclusion and exclusion at so many different levels within your culture and between your culture and other cultures, and it's defining who's inside the tent and who is outside of it. So these varieties of food then, these tremendous varieties of food, mirror the tremendous varieties of culture, and they are operating in this binary way of inclusion and exclusion. And when we're talking about these boundaries and drawing these cultural boundaries through symbolic uses of animals as metaphors for people and animals as food, that gets us right away to a particular kind of cultural identity, and that is ethnicity. So ethnicity is an extremely complex phenomenon, and we can think of ethnicity as it's a kind of identity where it involves the people who are in the same ethnic group have shared cultural values and norms and practices. An ethnic group defines itself and is defined by others as being distinct. And generally speaking, members of an ethnic group will define themselves as having some kind of a shared ancestry. They often speak the same language, not always, but very often, and they often share the same religious system. Now here's the interesting part. This is maybe one of the things that really differentiates ethnicity from culture, is that ethnicity is a phenomenon that always seems to exist within a broader social and political context. Ethnicity always seems to exist within the context of a complex state society. And maybe that's because states include or incorporate multiple different groups. So what do you do then? How do you define yourself when you see yourself as distinct and yet at the same time you're part of a broader whole? So ethnicity is kind of an idea of identity that maybe bridges between the cultural and the political. Another thing that derives from that is if ethnic identity is always within this context of a state, we talk about it in America as a hyphenated identity, right? You're this and this. What that means is ethnicity is expressed or not expressed contextually. Sometimes you want to really emphasize that aspect of your ethnicity. Other times you want to emphasize that aspect of your national identity. And we can all think of lots of examples of when ethnicity will be expressed or not expressed. Another key element for our discussion today that's really important is these last two things, that ethnicity is expressed both through conscious behavior, in other words, where you're consciously broadcasting who you are. You know, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay, as opposed to unconscious behavior, which also expresses your ethnic identity. It could be through your accent, your choice of vocabulary, your choice of dress, things that don't even occur to you, and yet to the world around you, they say, oh yeah, I know who that is, okay? So ethnicity is operating at this really interesting level of conscious and unconscious behavior, and that's a very valuable thing for us, actually. The final thing I want to mention, and this is really the bridge towards the archaeology part of it, is if ethnicity is expressed through both conscious and unconscious behavior, it is also something that is expressed or played out in material culture, in the physical objects that we make and that we use, and in how we use them. So that's really the link between ethnicity, behavior, and think about food behavior, okay? I had fun putting this slide together, too. I'm continuing my theme of trashing the French, of course, or maybe complimenting them, maybe just being jealous of them. But the point here is that ethnicity is something that is not innate. You're not born genetically as a specific identity. It is the kind of thing that is socialized into you from the time you're very, very young. And it's socialized in ways that your parents may be conscious of what they're doing, like this one about make your children like veggies. Or it may be unconscious and just, oh, look, here, honey, have some putrefied shark meat. That's really good. Yes, it is, Mommy. Okay, so this kind of socializing people into behaviors at a very young age means that we assimilate them before we're even really thinking about it, and then we don't think about it at all. It simply becomes hardwired into us as part of who we are, these kinds of food preferences. And they don't always get socialized in very easily. And this picture up here in the top right of this very unhappy little Korean boy learning how to eat with chopsticks. And if you look carefully, you can see it's special kitty chopsticks that won't sort of fall all over the place when he tries to eat with them. And I have a great deal of empathy with this young man, even though I don't know him. But it really conveys the message that these food preferences are related to ethnicity, they're related to culture, they're socialized into us, they become unconscious behaviors, and they have material correlates. They play out in the physical world of stuff. So that's my long segue into raising the question, can we look at things like ethnicity in ancient societies, in ancient civilizations? And I'm going to try and argue, yeah, you can. It's not easy, but you can do it. And I want to give you examples of looking at ethnicity archaeologically, so a couple of different case studies for how we can do that. Now, I like to think of there being three converging ways of knowing about the past. They converge, they're complementary, each of them has its advantages and disadvantages. And the shorthand I like to use is text, image, and artifact. Okay, the written record, that would be studied by philologists. At the Oriental Institute, we have practitioners of each of these three ways of knowing all in the same building, which makes water cooler conversations really interesting. So text, image, and artifact. And they each have advantages and disadvantages. Now, text. The written record, this is at Northwestern University. I ran across it on campus one day, and it just stopped me dead in my tracks. But I think it's quite interesting because it really shows the point that the written record is a two-edged sword. It gives tremendous richness of information about political systems, economic systems, codes of law, history, all of that information. And yet, it is a very, very seductive thing that can ultimately get you into a heap of trouble. Because the written record has a large number of biases in it. One is it can often be just so focused that it really doesn't, it's so focused that it's really hard to make out. If you want an example, I would say, think of the cash register slip from the supermarket. If the entire record of American civilization was just 5 boxes of cash register slips from Jewel, I can't say Dominic's anymore, see, that was a cultural code. If we would be really puzzled by it. And another thing is that the written record reflects ideological biases of the people who write the records. Less than 1% of ancient civilizations, of the people in ancient civilizations, were literate. So right away, those ancient societies, the written record is leaving out 99% of those societies. And even then, it's only reflecting the specific institutional needs of the organization that was doing the writing. It would be like having the records of a temple complex, and all they're talking about is buying sheep to be sacrificed. And that's an actual example from Mesopotamia, where we have thousands of records of sheep being delivered to this place that were then allocated someplace else to be sacrificed. Well, that's not the whole of Mesopotamian civilization. It's interesting, but it's not the whole of it. So written records are flawed, and they have ideological biases. You can't always believe them. You don't want to always believe them. Images. Well, images are wonderful. They tell you about symbolic systems of ancient cultures. But here's the thing. If you don't have a written record to contextualize those images, as rich as they are, they end up being very difficult to interpret, and the interpretations you come up with are more of a Rorschach test about the researcher than they are about the subject matter. So many of you may have been at the Field Museum and have seen that wonderful exhibit about Lascaux Cave. And part of it was this extraordinary wall painting inside the cave. And we really don't know what it is, but it looks like a human-animal transformation, and it's generally interpreted as being a shaman transforming himself into an animal. Is that what it was? I have no idea. But just to give you a sense of how complex and ambiguous it is, take this picture here, and if I hadn't put down the caption, this is from the movie An American Werewolf in London, I mean, what would you say that was? It would be really difficult to figure out. So images and art historical evidence are really, really important, but they do have their problems. The third line of evidence is artifact. And okay, I'll admit it, I'm a prehistorian and I fall on the artifact side of that Mercedes-Benz insignia I just showed you. Now, the archaeological record is crap, okay? Just let's get that out there. It is highly fragmentary, it is incomplete, it is full of problems. And yet, for all of those flaws, the archaeological record is a record of what economists would call observed preference. It shows what, and however incomplete, it shows what people actually did, not what they said they did. And I like to talk about this when I'm teaching a freshman intro class by saying to my students, well, let's just say you were going to tell your grandmother about what you did this last weekend. If you were to send them an email or write them a letter, you would never lie, of course, because you're a very honorable person, but you might not tell them everything that you did last weekend. On the other hand, if someone were to go to your dorm room and look at the contents of your wastebasket, and they pick through the various aluminum cans and other kinds of detritus, they might get a very different picture of what you did that weekend from what you tell grandma. And it's not even lying, it's simply being selective. It's different complementary forms of evidence. So I would submit, though, that artifactual evidence is extremely important. And if you can combine those three, text, artifact, and image, you have a very, very rich way of drawing insights into the ancient world. And one of the main forms of archaeological evidence that's especially valuable for doing that is animal bones. I think you could see that animal bones are one of the most common forms of data that you recover in an archaeological dig. And it's really good evidence when you're trying to look at ethnicity in ancient groups. Why? Because it's showing you the everyday practices of people. It's also showing you if it's the remains of a feast. It's showing you the evidence, the residues of conscious cultural behavior. So both the conscious and the unconscious stuff are all playing out in the animal bones. And it's garbage, so everyone just tosses it out, so it's there, and it preserves pretty well, massive amounts of it. And it can give us real deep insights into those elements of ethnicity that we're talking about. So what do you do? How do you handle that mass of data, all of those tiny fragments? Well, you have a laboratory, and in the laboratory you have a bunch of specimens of modern day animals where you know what the species of the animal is. You know exactly what its species is. You know how old it was when it died. You have all that information, and you can compare the fragments of bone that you dig up to these known animals and thereby identify them and figure out a lot of stuff from them. And just this is an example of there's a pig, a dog, sheep, a cow. I'm sorry, that's the sheep and that's the goat. Those can be tough to distinguish. Anyway, so by working with these materials in a comparative collection in a laboratory, you can figure out what the bones were. And the beauty of zooarchaeology, in contrast with like studying ceramics, is there's actually a right answer. Either it's a sheep or it's a pig. Either it's a tibia or it's a femur. Either it's fused or it's unfused. There's a right answer, and that's very satisfying to people like me who like definition, you know. Now, zooarchaeology then can be used to investigate a whole range of different kinds of research questions. We can study ancient environment, obviously ancient diet. One of the great things is we can study the domestication of animals. And that's a fascinating process. That's a whole other talk. But I just wanted to, as a teaser, I wanted to show you these tremendous differences between, there's a wild pig, note how alert, aggressive, tough it is, and then there are these guys, the domesticated pigs, and the same thing with the wild sheep and these guys. Okay, so domestication is a major economic change. Zooarchaeology is very good at studying that. We're also very good at studying social status, rich people versus poor people from the foods they ate, and we can study ancient religious practices, and we can study ethnicity. All right, so I'd like to give now 3 quick examples of how zooarchaeology can study ethnicity, what we can do with it. And the first one revolves around this idea of unconscious behavior. And there's one kind of unconscious behavior that's especially interesting to me. It's really kind of complicated, but I think there really is something very valuable in it, and that's the idea of technological style. In other words, you would think that's almost like a contradiction in terms, like technology is technology, except it's not. Different cultures choose to use one technology or another, or the way they deploy a technology is very, very culture bound. So there are technological styles where people can know about a technology, but just they don't want to use it. They're not into it. That's just the way it is. So one of those technological styles has to do with animals and with bones, and it's how do you butcher an animal? And again, you'd think, well, that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Well, no, it's not. It varies by culture. So I just wanted to quickly show you an example of that. I know this looks like a sort of a mass murderer's handbook, but bear with me. Okay, the example is a really neat one from the 19th century in California with the very large number of Chinese immigrants who came to the United States, many of whom came here to work on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And they were very badly mistreated. They were socially isolated. There were boycotts against them. They were very much marginalized, and it took a long time for them to be accepted and integrated into American society. So studying those early years is especially interesting. And a group of archaeologists studied a series of deposits from a Chinese grocery store in Madera County, California, the grocery store and the associated work camps with it. And they were interested in looking at Chinese immigrant acculturation in the US. And they found some really neat things about technological style in butchery as this kind of unconscious practice. That Euro-American butchers in the 19th century, I love this guy wearing a top hat while he's doing his work. They were much classier now then than they are now. But here you can see, I want you to notice the saw there. Basically, butchers at that time would use bone saws to disarticulate the skeletons and to make different cuts of meat for sale. Okay, so a butcher would sell prepared cuts of meat. But when they looked at the remains from the Chinese workmen's camps around this grocery store, what they found is that the Chinese immigrants continued to use their traditional Chinese styles of butchery from their homeland. So they weren't buying prepared cuts of sawed meat. They were buying hunks of meat and then chopping them up with meat cleavers into small pieces that they would then cook. And they were using the exact same deep technology that you can still see in Hong Kong. Here's a butcher in modern Hong Kong with a meat cleaver disarticulating cuts of meat this is how the technological style of Chinese culture works. So it's unconscious. If you'd asked one of these immigrants, why are you doing it that way? They'd say, what do you mean? That's how we do it. All right. So that's an example of looking at ethnicity through zooarchaeology, but very strongly aided by the textual record. I mean, I was dissing the textual record before, but without that historical information, it would be quite difficult. And here's another example of looking at ethnicity through zooarchaeology with the help of the textual record. And that is the Jewish community in Amsterdam in the 17th century. It turns out that Holland was one of the first countries, as they became independent from Spain, to declare a national policy of religious tolerance. And so a large group of Portuguese Jews emigrated to the Netherlands at that time. And there was a whole Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. This is the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, the neighborhood. And excavations in Amsterdam from the 17th century levels, they were able to look at Jewish neighborhoods and Christian neighborhoods in Amsterdam by looking at their cesspits, okay? So just to bring the level of discourse down a bit, very far down. So why dig cesspits? Because, if you'll pardon the pun, everything gets dumped in there. All right, sooner or later, everything gets into the cesspit. So, for instance, serving maids who broke the really good china, you have to get rid of it, you dump it in the cesspit. Your daily garbage, you dump it in the cesspit. So it's a really phenomenal, if you can get over the gag reflex, it's a phenomenal source of information about ancient and historic societies. So they recovered very large amounts, actually about a metric ton of animal bones from these cesspits in the Christian and the Jewish neighborhoods. And what they found was really fascinating because it confirmed behaviorally what we see in the textual record. So the cesspits from the Jewish neighborhood pretty much conform to the Jewish dietary laws, which are called kashrut, or whether it's kosher or not. And they're very complex. So I'm just giving a very abbreviated summary here, but different animals are allowed and different ones are forbidden. And again, it's these boundaries of inclusion and exclusion drawn through the use of food. So allowed foods are cows, sheep, goats, chicken, fish with fins and scales. But birds of prey are forbidden, pigs, rabbits are forbidden, lobster, shrimp, scallops, clams, oysters are all forbidden in the kosher laws. These laws also extend to butchery as it happens. So in Judaism, you're supposed to slaughter the animal as painlessly as possible by severing the carotid artery and the vagus nerve in one swift cut to kill the animal as painlessly as possible. You also have to drain the blood because in Judaism, you're not allowed to eat or drink blood. And finally, there are all these like crazy restrictions. I shouldn't say that. That was not right. There are all these elaborate restrictions that require you to remove the sciatic nerve from the hind limbs. You have to remove all the veins and arteries and sinews. And for the hind part of cattle, it's incredibly hard to do that. So what Jewish butchers tend to do is the front part of the animal is fine and is kosher, but the hindquarters, unless you go through all this elaborate pre-processing, it's just not worth it. So generally speaking, those would be sold to Gentiles, whereas the kosher front part would be sold to Jews. Now, what did they find? What they found was that the contents of the cesspits mirrored those dietary restrictions. So in the Jewish neighborhood, there was 0 to 1% pigs in the cesspits. So if they were having ribs, they were throwing them out somewhere else. They found cattle bones, but only from the front half of the animal. The whole rear half of the animal was missing from those cesspits. And then the main poultry that they ate was chicken. By contrast, in the Christian, the cesspits in the Christian neighborhood, it was over 15% pig. Both the front and the back halves of the cattle were there, and they mainly ate duck as their main form of poultry. Now, one of the neatest things that they found in the cesspit was, along with all of those chicken bones in the cesspits in the Jewish neighborhood, they found these things, these little lead seals, which are inscribed in Hebrew. It says kosher on it right there, and it also has the day of the week on it. What these were are guarantees that the chicken had been ritually slaughtered in the proper kosher way and what day of the week it was. So it was basically a use-by date. It was a guarantee of freshness. So it would have the number of the day of the week. And almost all of the chicken, these lead seals, had 5 on it, meaning Thursday. So the animals were slaughtered on Thursday so that they could be eaten in the Sabbath meal on Friday night. So it's a beautiful example of the way other kinds of material culture match up really elegantly with the faunal data. Okay, so what you've seen is that you can look at ethnicity pretty well as long as you have the written record to give you hints, to tell you, by the way, 2 different ethnic groups are present. Oh, and by the way, these are the practices of one of those groups. And then you say, okay, just go out by the numbers, dig it up, and fit the archaeological data to the textual data. So that part is relatively simple. The real question is, what happens if you try and push it back? What happens if you try and look in prehistoric situations or textually undocumented situations? Can you look at ethnicity? And that's what I've been trying to do in my research on the world's earliest urban society called the Uruk culture of Mesopotamia, named after the city of Uruk. And I'm just going to go through these relatively quickly. Uruk was the first city in the world. It was the largest city on the planet at the time. It had very elaborate architecture with these ceramic wall cones. It had the earliest evidence for kingship. It had a elaborate system of record keeping that used cylinder seals, and eventually, at the end of the Uruk period, they did invent writing, the world's first written documents. And as part of the development of urbanism in the state in the Uruk period, they also founded the world's earliest known colonial network, where they set up trading colonies all the way up the Euphrates River into North Syria and the mountains of Anatolia and the highlands of Iran to get raw materials that they needed, like copper and lumber and precious stones. So they set up more than 20 of these trading colonies. And they're very easy to recognize. Well, not really easy, but you can recognize them by a number of material signatures, like those wall cones I was showing you, styles of pottery, house forms. In the upper right, I guess this pointer isn't particularly showing up, forms of temples, systems of weights and measures, and the use of this administrative technology of cylinder seals. So I was looking at this question of studying the Uruk colonial system by working at this site called Hacinebi in the Euphrates Valley. And it's at the juncture of two of the most important trade routes of the ancient Near East, the Euphrates River, and which it overlooks, and also a river crossing point on what would later be known as the Silk Road. So it conformed to the three laws of real estate: location, location, and location. Here's a view of Hacinebi. And what we found is one part of the site in the north area, Area A, had an especially high concentration of pottery and material culture from southern Mesopotamia, even though it's 1,500 kilometers north of the city of Uruk. And we found some of it in situ on the floors of houses. Most of it was found as garbage. But the point is that it was a whole range of garbage. Items of everyday use, prestige goods, pottery, these wall cones associated with decorating public buildings. And it was existing alongside of the local Anatolian culture at the site. So it was like most of the site was these local Anatolian people. Part of the site was these Mesopotamians. They used separate record-keeping systems. The Anatolians used stamp seals, and the Mesopotamians used cylinder seals. And the question was, well, everything in the material record suggests that there are two different ethnic groups at this site. So would that be reflected in the animal bone remains? And the short answer is yes. What you can see here, these blue bars are from the Uruk parts of the site. The green bars are from the Anatolian parts of the site. And there's a big difference in how much people liked sheep and goat, the food preference. In the Uruk part of the site, 80% of the bones are sheep and goat. They loved kebabs in Mesopotamia, apparently. They ate small amounts of cattle and small amounts of pig. And the local Anatolians had a much more varied diet. Now, it gets really interesting when you compare what we found in the Uruk neighborhoods at Hacinebi with sites back in the southern Mesopotamian homeland. And it's almost exactly the same. I promised I wouldn't show histograms, but I'm showing these two, so please forgive me. This is the use of sheep and goat. 80% of the bones at Hacinebi in the Uruk neighborhood were sheep and goat. Look at that. Almost every other site in southern Mesopotamia, 80% of what they're eating is sheep and goats. And then when you compare the local Anatolian neighborhoods at Hacinebi with other local Anatolian sites in southeast Turkey, they all have this very broad mixture. And we like to say that if it mooed, oinked, or bleated, that the Anatolians would eat it. Then we looked at these unconscious aspects of habitus, or daily practice, in the technological style of butchery. So we took the bones from the local parts of the site and compared them with the bones from the Uruk parts of the site to see where the butchery cuts. And I think you can see that the Uruk ones are on top. They butchered the animal. The cut marks cluster in different places. So they were butchering the animals in different ways. And then one of my students, for his senior honors thesis, measured the kerfs on the cut marks. I never knew the word kerf, K-E-R-F, before. It's a great Scrabble word. And what it means is the width of a cut. Apparently, if you're building a set in the theater, you need to know your kerfs and measure them. So this guy measured the widths of the kerfs and compared the bones from the Uruk part of the site with the bones from the local Anatolian part of the site. And lo and behold, The kerfs are much wider in the local part of the site. And it's because they were using different tools. They preferred to use different tools to cut up the animals. So they preferred different foods. They cut them up in different ways, in different places, and they used different tools to do it. So the faunal evidence, the animal bone remains, give this tremendous richness in showing that, in fact, everything there conforms to what we know or we think we know about ethnic differences in food preferences. So it really does look like there was a colony of ethnically distinct Mesopotamians living up there in southeast Turkey, what's now southeast Turkey. So I would argue then that on the basis of that, we can actually study ethnicity in the archaeological record. And if we really pay attention to archaeological context, and if we don't just look at the animal bones, but look at the other kinds of material evidence, even in the absence of written writing, we can actually look at ethnicity and relations between ethnic groups in prehistoric situations 5,500 years ago. To me, that's an extraordinary thing in terms of what it tells us about both the diversity of human culture and the continuities in human culture, and in how, in many basic ways, we relate to animals in fundamentally similar ways across space and across time. Now, that's assuming that there are really strong boundaries between different ethnic groups. But what happens as we go forward? We talk about globalization all the time. What's the impact of globalization going to be on ethnicity? And that's, gosh, that's a several beer conversation, I suppose. But I think it's very appropriate that we have this conversation right before Thanksgiving, because that's one of the best known intercultural feasts that is a defining thing in American culture. And that's the point I wanted to leave you with, that American culture is very interesting in that we embrace, for all our ups and downs in it, we do embrace diversity. That diversity has been there from the word go in the founding of our culture and our society. It was there with the Pilgrims, and it's the work of archaeologists. I'm really glad I'm not going to make it for another 30 years, because archaeologists in the future are going to have a much harder time using bone remains as indicators of ethnicity. And things like having halal KFC and kosher McDonald's, it's blurring and blending these different ethnic categories in ways that will make my successors at the Oriental Institute much more reluctant to ever give a talk at the Chicago Humanities Festival. So I want to leave you with a quote by Robert McCormick Adams, who was the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Provost of the University of Chicago, former director of the Oriental Institute. I love this. He said, archaeologists need to have a high tolerance for ambiguity, and they must be willing to be wrong 99% of the time. So in the hope that I'm in that 1% of the time, I want to thank you for your attention.